many, if not all, of these detention facilities, whether they be, here I'm including the ICE facilities, which really aren't a whole lot better in terms of their respect for human rights and for due process of law than are the local facilities that are handling these cases under contract. There's many, many instances of violence and verbal and even sexual abuse from both inmates and guards in these facilities. I mean, some of these things are kind of standard things that you know about with respect to prisons. So imagine an immigration detainee who's never been in trouble with the law, has never committed a crime, has never been imprisoned before, being put into a prison with a number of violent offenders, right? The problems that you could imagine ensue are not really that difficult to think about. A lot of these detention centers engage in very harsh disciplinary measures, including shackles, prison jumpsuits, and extended solitary confinement for people who are deemed to be uncooperative. It's actually really remarkable if you look at some of the stories that have been compiled by agencies like the ACLU. The Human Rights Watch has actually compiled a report about detention facilities and the abuses that go on in them. The degree to which these kinds of things, like putting shackles on people's legs or putting immigration detainees into solitary confinement because they're deemed to be uncooperative, the frequency with which that happens is actually quite remarkable. For a lot of children who are detained, they're often detained in juvenile, in facilities for juvenile offenders, i.e. Juvenile delinquents. This is in direct violation of a Supreme Court case that was issued in 1997, the Flores case, that held that immigration detainees who are minors should not be housed with people who are juvenile delinquents, but rather should be housed in humane facilities and provided with educational services, health services, a number of conditions that were set forth in that decision that ICE's predecessor organization, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, was bound to comply with, they don't comply with. One of the things that has received a lot of attention recently is the lack of medical care in the ICE facilities and also in the contract jails. There's been a lot of publicity on the many deaths in ICE custody over the last year or so. There are a couple of very well publicized deaths. In January 2010, the New York Times ran a feature story on the death of one particular immigrant who died, I believe, of heart failure. After having complained many, many times and asked for medical care, he finally collapsed. His fellow inmates asked the guards to get him medical care. Everybody ignored him, and he died on the floor of the cell, and that was in 2009. So this is just one of many cases where medical care is simply denied. The authorities simply don't believe people have medical needs. They don't provide doctors when they're needed. And a number of people have died in custody. And that Janet Napolitano in October of 2009 was sufficiently alarmed by the number of deaths that she ordered an investigation into the detention conditions and the provision of medical care there. In general, there's a complete lack of educational programs, of recreational activities, of reading materials in these detention centers. There's also a lack of interpreters. And interestingly, if you go on the detention and removal office website, one of the links that they have there is a very lovely brochure that's called the Handbook for Detainees. And it's available in English and Spanish. It's a kind of glossy, it has pictures of these, supposedly very modern and sophisticated jails. So you see the interiors. There's a couple pictures of inmates playing checkers in their little prison jumpsuits. And it's very interesting. One of the sections is know your rights, right? So it has a list of your right to appeal if you're classified in a way that you think is inappropriate. So for example, when you go into immigration detention, they classify you into one of three categories, and you wear a different colored jumpsuit depending on which category you're in. So if you're a dangerous alien, you have to wear a red jumpsuit, and then there's a green jumpsuit and an orange. It sort of corresponds to the colors of the terrorism alert, the yellow, the red. It's very interesting. So if you don't agree with that classification, obviously if you get classified as a dangerous alien, it means you're subjected to maximum security conditions and possibly isolation. So you have the right to appeal according to this book. But I read through the entire book, and nowhere in the entire book is it mentioned that the detainees have the right to an interpreter, right? And the book is in English and Spanish, so what happens if you don't speak either of those two languages or you can't read? But the underlying point, the fact that there's a complete absence of the notion that anybody might ever need an interpreter for any reason, right? For medical care, for appeal of a disciplinary proceeding. There simply is no mention of that at all. There's also a great deal of difficulty in contacting attorneys and family members from the inside of these detention centers. Often, people may have heard of these scams that phone companies have where they charge inmates a great deal of money to make phone calls from the prison because they don't have, prisoners don't have a choice. There's only this one phone in the prison, and they often charge $2 or $3 a minute for telephone calls. A lot of people can't afford them. There's a lack of communication facilities in general. There's a huge amount of difficulty in complaining about conditions in these detention centers, or complaining about abusive guards or abusive other inmates. And perhaps the biggest problem, or one of the biggest problems, it's not the biggest, but it's one of the biggest problems, is the fact that the ICE authorities constantly relocate people from one detention center to another. And it appears that there does seem to be a pattern of people who complain being relocated to a different place within a few days of filing a complaint. And this appears to be intended to squash whatever complaint might be being made by removing the inmate from the situation about which he is complaining and therefore making the problem moot, and B, really punishing the inmate by relocating to a place where his family isn't told where he is, etc. And also, it serves the purpose of removing the detainee from contact with their attorney. Right? So the whole idea of prosecuting a complaint for conditions inside the detention center is stymied by this process of constantly moving people around. Now, the relocation issue has to do also with the problem of discretion in the ICE and the abuse of discretion. And that has to do with the fact that immigration enforcement is a federal matter. The ICE has the power, once they arrest somebody, to detain that individual virtually anywhere within the United States. So among the various problems that arise from that pretty unfettered discretion is that we see inmates, or detainees rather, who are arrested, for example, in New England and Massachusetts, being sent to prisons in Louisiana or Texas. Often these detention centers, whether they're private or local or ICE operated, are in rural areas that have very few attorneys, that are difficult to get to, that make it very hard for the detainee's family to even visit the person. And again, we have this problem of this continual moving around of people so that one never quite knows where a given inmate is on a given day. That problem is then compounded by the fact that ICE isn't really accountable for these things, and they themselves do not have a centralized tracking system for figuring out where a given detainee is at a given point in time. They also don't have a system for tracking how long detainees are being held. Now, supposedly under the law, if you're going to be deported, you're not supposed to be held in detention for more than 6 months. But in fact, there are a lot of people awaiting deportation who have been in these various kinds of jails for 2 years, 3 years, even up to 5 years, according to reports filed by Amnesty International. So these are really major problems. Now, the question of the detention business is very interesting, and like imprisonment for criminal violations, there's been a very rapid growth over the last 10 years of private prisons that take inmates coming from the criminal justice system, but they also make a very pretty penny on detaining immigrants. And they have sort of jumped on what people are calling the immigrant gold rush, which is basically the business of detaining as many immigrants as possible and charging the federal government as much money as possible per inmate per day. So for example, these private companies, one of them, the famous one is the Corrections Corporation of America, CCA, most people have heard of. There's another one that used to be called Wackenhut Corrections, and now it's called Geo Group. Right? This is another example, like Blackwater changing its name to Z. This is the geo